The topic of today's lecture is From Viking Roots to Norman Rule, the Ancestral Tapestry of William the Conqueror. In previous talks, we've had a look at the situation and the background of Norman England at the time of the conquest and the period following the conquest and the early days of William's rule. We're mostly going to focus today on William's predecessors and how a an essentially Viking lineage resulted in the Norman conquest and the Norman kings of England, and how these pieces all fit together. Before we go into that topic, let's start with a brief introduction, so a little about myself. I'm a genealogical researcher with a particular interest in royal lineages and history, especially around the era of the conquest, though I'm also interested in some later and earlier history as well. I have been studying my own family history for over 10 years with a focus on the Dorset line of the Ironside family. I talked a little bit about my research and findings in my previous talk on tracing your royal ancestry, so be sure to check that out on our YouTube channel if you would be interested in learning more. I'm an active member of the Anglican Church, where I serve as an acolyte. I'm additionally a Benedictine Camaldolese Oblate of a Catholic monastery in India. My interests include church history, theology, and philosophy, and I'm currently studying the latter at Domuni Universitas. In terms of my involvement with the Augustan Society, I'm presently serving as the Dean of the Society of Descendants of the Conquest and as books editor at the Augustan Society. To briefly introduce the organizational side of things, the Augustan Society was founded in 1957 and is a group of both amateur and professional scholars who focus on the fields of chivalry, genealogy, heraldry, ancient medieval history, and royalty and nobility. So we have quite a broad sphere of specializations or areas that we're involved with, and you can learn lots more about our various activities and areas of interest on our website, which will be linked at the end of this presentation or hopefully in the YouTube description down below for those who are joining us later. The Society of Descendants of the Conquest is one of the various lineage groups that are pendant to the Augustan Society. This particular group was founded in 1980 with the purpose of honoring the memory and accomplishments of William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy and later King of England, and his companions in the conquest, as well as to gather together persons of Norman royal and noble ancestry, preserving their genealogical records and focusing on the study of the history of England and Normandy in the 11th century. Membership is open to anyone who can trace their ancestry either to William the Conqueror himself or to one of his recognized companions. So we have two classes of membership, the Conqueror class and the Companion class. Again, plenty more information about our society and how to get involved can be found on the website, which will be linked at the end of the presentation. To now go into the presentation proper, I believe in this case it would be most suitable to begin at the end. Who was William the Conqueror? Well, this significant historical figure was born around 1028 in the fortified town of Falaise in the heart of Normandy. His life was an extraordinary one by any evaluation of what he achieved. And this, of course, culminated in his crowning as the King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, at Westminster Abbey. Yet his story did not begin in England, nor even in Normandy. but rather far earlier, in the cold and unforgiving landscapes of Viking Scandinavia. William's father was Robert I, the Duke of Normandy, known both as Robert the Magnificent and Robert the Devil. He had an audacious spirit that William would inherit. His mother, variously known as Herliver and by other names as well, came from a far more modest background. She's believed to have possibly been the daughter of a tanner from Falaise. Her relationship with Robert was never formalized, making William an illegitimate child, something that would plague him throughout his life, and in fact earned him the sobriquet William the Bastard. So we see that William had a somewhat complex background, complex past. William the Conqueror, of course, is most famous for leading the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066, culminating in the Battle of Hastings, and as previously mentioned, he was crowned on Christmas Day of the same year. Well, let's go right back to the earliest stage in this series of descendancy, beginning with his Viking roots. His family story really begins with Rollo, a Viking chieftain who rose from raiding to ruling, and he also had an incredible story. Rollo's origins are as shadowy as the mists of his homeland. What is known is that he was born around the year 860, most likely from Norway or Denmark, and he was part of a wave of Norsemen who terrorized Europe's coast in the 9th and 10th centuries. He was known for his immense size and strength and gained notoriety as a fierce warrior and leader. It's an interesting legend about Rollo that he was so large that he couldn't ride a horse and had to walk everywhere on foot. So that really goes to show how powerful, how large he was, both literally and metaphorically. Right? He definitely inspired fear in his enemies. Rollo's path to power really began with raids along the Seine River. The chaos of those incursions caused forced King Charles the Simple of West Francia to negotiate with the Viking leader. And in 911, the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte was signed. As part of this treaty, Rollo agreed to defend the Seine against further Viking attacks and also to convert to Christianity. To what extent Rollo's conversion was a true act of faith, or to what extent it was more of a political arrangement, is widely negotiated by historians. However, it does seem that as Rollo aged, as he got a bit older, he did demonstrate some amount of genuine faith with many donations to monasteries, the building of new monasteries and restoration works and so on. So it's a debate. There's some question as to how genuine this might have been, but it most likely started as more of a kind of political arrangement. In return for Rollo's promise and conversion, King Charles granted him a large swath of land centered on Rouen, a territory that would come to be known as Normandy. Now, if we look at the etymology of Normandy, it essentially just means the land of the Northmen, right? The Northmen being the Vikings. So Rollo was baptized, taking the Christian name Robert. Despite having taken this later Christian name, he's still much better known by his earlier name, Rollo. Now, his conversion was significant for multiple reasons. By adopting the faith of his subjects, he solidified his legitimacy as their ruler. There was in this historical context, there's no situation in which a pagan or heathen ruler would be able to rule over Christian subjects, right? It would just not be seen as legitimate. So this really was the first step in achieving a sense of legitimacy among the French. An interesting legend goes that during the treaty negotiations, Rollo refused to kneel before the king to swear fealty. So we already have uh, this sign of him being a rather stubborn leader, not willing to bend the knee for anyone, instead ordering one of his men to perform the act. The warrior did so begrudgingly, lifting Charles's foot so abruptly that the king fell backward, much to the amusement of the Vikings. Whether the story is real or simply an amusing anecdote, it goes to show the sort of attitude between the newly arrived Norsemen and their French counterparts. So, how was Rollo in terms of his leadership? Rollo ruled Normandy with a combination of Viking vigor and Frankish diplomacy. He was a very quick learner. He was able to adapt to the new society very effectively and found a balance which would work very well, both in terms of maintaining the loyalty of the Northmen who followed him across and of gaining new allies and forming new friendships with the local Frankish people. He did this for a variety of ways. He encouraged his warriors to settle, to marry local women, and adopt the culture of the region. Over time, these Norsemen became more genuinely Norman, blending their Scandinavian roots with the customs of their new homelands. Rollo's reign marks the beginning of a dynasty that would last for centuries, laying the foundations for his descendants, including, of course, William the Conqueror, to rise to power. How about the woman of this story? Well, following the treaty, Rollo may have married Gisela, thought to be the daughter of King Charles. There's some historical debate about exactly where Gisela fits into the story and whether she was a legitimate or illegitimate daughter of Charles the Simple. Because if she was legitimate, she could have been at most 5 years old at the date of the treaty, with her father having married Queen Frederuna of Saxony in 907. So if it was a marriage, it would have been a purely political, symbolic one at that point. If she was legitimate, though there is the possibility of her being an older, illegitimate daughter as well. Now, Gisela did not have a son with Rollo, therefore she is not a link in our ancestral tapestry of William the Conqueror. That would be a later woman, Poppa of Bayeux, who would be taken as his wife according to Danish custom, Mordanico. Now, the Mordanico tradition is a really interesting one. It was a northern pagan tradition of kings or rulers or dukes taking not only a wife in the traditional married sense, but taking extra wives or extra mistresses who would have some but not all of the legitimacy of their main or primary wife. So it's a very interesting but rather complicated tradition. And as we're going to see later, the fact that Rollo was able to get away with having another wife in the Mordanico tradition is actually quite surprising in the Christian context of Normandy. And the fact that he was able to do so, and not only he, but his descendants were able to do so, is a sign of just how powerful the Norman leaders were. So just keep that in mind because we will see further examples of this. In fact, it will become a bit of a trend among Rollo's descendants taking of a wife in the Danish custom, a second wife in the Danish custom. So it is this Popper of Bayeux who is in fact the wife according to, uh, sorry, it was Popper of Bayeux who in fact is the link in William's ancestral tree. Right, well, a little more then about, well, before we move on, so Rollo ruled Normandy until his retirement around the year 927. At that age, that date he passed his leadership to his son, William the First, also known as William Longsword. And there are some legends that while Rollo lived publicly as a Christian, and as I mentioned earlier, did make generous donations to various monasteries and abbeys and so on, that he may have maintained some Norse traditions, some pagan traditions alongside his Christian faith. As well as the men in the story who generally get all of the attention when we look at the ancestry of William the Conqueror, I'd really like to spend some time looking at the woman as well. Unfortunately, as is so often the case in historical research, there is much less information available, many less details in the primary or secondary sources regarding the woman. Hence, the section will be briefer, but I would like to at least briefly provide an overview of some of these very interesting women who we know, unfortunately, so little about. So, Popper of Bayeux, an often overlooked figure in the story of the Norman world, as Rollo's wife or consort and the mother of William Longsword, her role was certainly instrumental in the establishment of this Norman dynasty. She's thought to have been born around the year 880 and was likely the daughter of Berengar of Rennes, a powerful Frankish nobleman who held a lot of influence in Brittany, a neighboring duchy. Her connection to Rollo is both romanticized and debated, and much of her life is cloaked in legend. So that's another real challenge when we look at this through a historical lens to sort of distinguish between the legends or the romanticized versions of her life and stories, or in fact of all of the lives and stories of these people we're looking at today, and the pure historical facts. According to some accounts, she was captured during one of Rollo's raids in Bayeux in the early 10th century, being taken as a political hostage or bride, so it may not have been exactly a peaceful, consensual match. Um, and while this really emphasizes this legend, again, it may or may not be true, really emphasizes the Viking ferocity of Rollo's conquest. It also speaks to his wish to form alliances between conquerors and the local elite, right? His wish as a conqueror to form alliances in the purpose of legitimizing his rule. We need to remember that this was a time when political marriages often sealed alliances, so Popper's union with Rollo likely served to legitimize his rule over Normandy in the eyes of the Frankish population and that of the neighboring duchies. She brought with her ties to Frankish nobility, integrating their family's influence into the burgeoning Norman state. Their relationship, although not formalized by marriage in the Christian sense, exemplifies the blending of cultures that would go on to define Normandy. essentially Scandinavian strength united with Frankish sophistication. Popper's legacy is most clearly exemplified through the life of her son, William Longsword. He was born in 893, and Popper would have played a key role in his upbringing, instilling in him this dual heritage of Viking ambition and Frankish diplomacy. It is through her lineage that Norman dukes claimed a connection to the Frankish aristocracy. And again, this all combines, it all merges to just bolster that legitimacy in the eyes of subjects and rivals alike. So, turning to William Longsword. With Rollo having set the foundation for Normandy, it was really his son who began the work of transforming it into a stable and influential power. So, if we are to associate William Longsword with anything, it's with consolidation and stability. Again, he was born around the year 893. He certainly inherited his father's ambition, though he was perhaps arguably more refined in his approach to leadership, leaving behind, in many ways, the raider characteristic of his Viking forebears and taking on an aristocratic characteristic. William assumed the Duchy of Normandy in 927 upon Rollo's retirement. He was still a young man, but his role quickly established him as a capable and powerful leader. In contrast to his father, who earned his title through conquest, William sought to solidify the realm through alliances, treaties, and careful governance. This strategy was absolutely vital, as at this time Normandy was really just a patchwork of Norse settlers and local Frankish populations, each with distinct traditions and loyalties. So there wasn't really uniformity alongside among the population. There would have been pockets of Normans, pockets of Frankish people, and so there wasn't a true integration yet at this stage. He also gained this epithet longsword for his martial prowess and leadership on the battlefield. One of William's early accomplishments was extending Norman influence far beyond the borders originally established by Rollo. This was achieved both through negotiation, again, the forming of alliances, and through military action. And he managed to expand the duchy's territory and lands from the west and south into Normandy's territory. This, of course, strengthened Normandy's position within the fragmented kingdom of West Francia, securing its status as a duchy of growing power. One such very significant alliance was that between William and Hugh the Great, then Count of Paris, and one of the most powerful magnates in West Francia. This cooperation not only safeguarded Normandy's borders, but also placed William in the broader political game of the Frankish realm. So we now have this next level game going on, right? Not only do we have these Normans firmly established in their new duchy, or they're quite relatively young duchy, but we now have a broader political Game of Thrones among the Frankish nobles themselves. The very fact of William's success in these alliances reveal his shrewd understanding of diplomacy. a skill that, as we will see, would become a hallmark of Norman rulers. However, William's life was not without strife. His rule faced significant opposition from both local lords and external rivals, some of whom viewed the Norman duchy as a significant threat. In 939, William became embroiled in a conflict with Arnulf I, the Count of Flanders, over territorial disputes. So William's attempts to expand the duchy, to push those borders further back, did not go unchallenged. Before we continue to the end of William's story, an interesting anecdote perhaps helps to illustrate the relationship between the Norman dukes and the church at this time. And we see this illustrated and told here in this manuscript, the Gesta Normanorum Ducum. One anecdote about William Longsword involves an incident where the Duke, while traveling with his entourage, encountered a group of monks. They invited him to share in their humble meal, though he refused, feeling that the meal was not suitable for a mighty Duke such as himself. At the time of this meeting, the monks were clearing the ground of the site of a future monastery, and he was returning from a hunting trip. In refusing the meal, he professed his preference for hunting an enormous wild boar that had been spotted in the region. However, during the hunt, the boar attacked the Duke, wounding him severely and leading him to conclude that he was in fact unwise in rejecting the monk's hospitality. So, while merely an anecdote and not necessarily a true story, this event illustrates perhaps the relationship between the Duke and the Church, a rather complex relationship, as we can see, but it would lead to, or perhaps it's used to explain Duke William's deeper involvement with the Church and his great generosity in terms of funding monasteries and in particular rebuilding the monastery of the Story, among others as well. William is perhaps most famous for his death. The conflict previously mentioned between William and Arnulf I, the Count of Flanders, over territorial disputes, culminated in a betrayal that would cost William his life. In December of 942, during what was supposed to be a peace conference on an island in the Somme River, William was ambushed and assassinated by men loyal to the rival count. This ambush highlighted the volatile and treacherous nature of 10th century European politics. And his death really marked a turning point for Normandy. While he had been a stabilizing presence in his life and a force of consolidation for the duchy, his murder left Normandy in a precarious position, with his young son Richard I suddenly thrust into the heights of leadership. Despite this tragic end, William's achievements, his expansion of Norman territory, and his diplomatic acumen laid a strong foundation for his son and the generations to follow. Turning now to the female link in this part of the story. We will introduce Sparta of Brittany. Very little is known about Sprotter, as mentioned earlier. There's very limited information in the primary sources about these figures, with men generally getting all the attention. And as a result, her origins are rather obscure. She's thought to be of either Breton or Frankish descent, a detail that remains debated among historians. Much like William's father Rollo's relationship, the relationship between Sprotter and William Longsword began as a Moordanical union, or a marriage in the Danish fashion. This partnership not being recognized by the church. However, Sprotter would bear William Longsword's only son, William I, around 932, who would inherit the duchy under the tumultuous circumstances just mentioned following his father's assassination. Her role became even more crucial following William's assassination. As a foreign-born consort, her position in Normandy was vulnerable. Her son was but a young child, and they both faced significant threats from rivals who sought to exploit his father's absence. It seems that Sprotter likely fled to safety following the assassination of William, possibly returning to Breton roots to protect Richard during his minority. And we learn that she did remarry. She remarried a man by the name of Esperling, a wealthy landowner in the region. After which she disappears from the historical record. So very little information there, but worth considering and examining in the context of the larger tapestry of William's ancestors. Right, so turning to the son, William and Sprotter's son, Richard I. He would ascend to the duchy at a very young age, rising from a vulnerable child to a powerful duke that would secure Normandy's place in medieval Europe. Beginning of his life, At the beginning of his life, we see a bit of a mixture of both promise and peril. It's never easy as a young child to ascend the throne or ascend to the duchy at such a young age. There are many challenges, many rival claimants and threats to his rule. Obviously, his status as a minor made him a prime target for these ambitious rivals, significantly among them King Louis IV of West Francia, who wished to curtail Norman independence. As a result, he took the young Richard into custody, or kidnapped him, ostensibly to provide protection, but more realistically, more likely to assert his control over Normandy. Richard was held at Laon, effectively a royal hostage, while Norman lords scrambled to maintain order in the duchy. So after the process of consolidating and making stable the duchy under the rules of his father and grandfather, we now have a period of absolute chaos and a scrambling for power. It was in this period of captivity that Richard's resilience began to shine. According to later Norman chroniclers, Richard escaped from Laon with the help of loyal supporters, including Osmond de Kentville and Bernard de Dane. These figures orchestrated his flight back to Normandy, where Richard reclaimed his position as Duke. The details of the escape are shrouded in legend, but the event marked a turning point in his life, establishing him as a figure of determination. Once safely back in Normandy, Richard faced the daunting task of securing his rule. He relied heavily on the support of his Viking descended nobles, who helped him in fending off external threats, including those continuing threats from King Louis IV. By 945, Richard had formed a powerful alliance with Hugh the Great, Count of Paris, and gained a decisive victory over the Frankish king. So we have a bit of a shifting in the balance of power. Louis himself was captured during the conflict, and Richard's position was significantly strengthened. Richard's rule spanned over 50 years, so quite a significant time, quite a significant period of time for that era. It was a period of both consolidation and cultural transformation, and he really followed in the footsteps of his father and grandfather in this continuous blending of Viking traditions with Frankish customs. He was a shrewd diplomat, forging alliances through marriage, including his union with Gunna, a woman thought to be of Danish descent, who would become his lifelong companion. Such alliances continued to extend Norman influence beyond its borders and solidify its role as a key player in the politics of medieval Europe. Much like his father and to some extent his grandfather, Richard had a very strong relationship with the church. He supported the establishment of monasteries and he actively encouraged the spread of Christianity in Normandy. This helped to reinforce his legitimacy as a Christian ruler and also align Normandy more closely with this broader European political and religious framework of the Catholic Church. Richard would have a number of very historically significant descendants, including his son, Richard II, known as Richard the Good, who succeeded him as Duke of Normandy, and also Emma of Normandy, a fascinating woman in her own right, who would become Queen of England through her marriages to Ethelred the Unready and Canute the Great. We'll have a look at her, although she's not a direct link in the ancestry of William the Conqueror, she's fascinating enough to have a look at as a little sidetrack. Well, having a bit of a deeper look at Gunna. Gunna was the wife, Mordanico, of Richard the First, although they would actually legitimize their marriage in the Christian sense later on and then marry um, in a ceremony that was blessed by the church. She's thought to have been born around 936 of Danish descent, and her family were well connected with the Norman court. There are various legends about their first meeting. One legend says that it was originally her sister who caught the young Duke's attention. However, when her family insisted that Gunnar would be a more suitable partner, she ended up becoming his companion and eventually his duchess. Gunnar was not a passive figure in the Norman court. And so while there are very limited historical sources on these women, it's not necessarily to say that they were unimportant figures. And in fact, a number of these very interesting women had extremely active roles in the political life of the realm. Gunnar was deeply involved in the governance of the duchy, advising Richard on matters of state and playing a central role in building alliances through her familial connections. Her intelligence and political acumen made her a respected figure among the Norman nobles, and she was known for her ability to effectively mediate disputes and maintain stability within the realm. One of her most enduring contributions was her role in securing the Norman succession. As we mentioned, she and Richard really had quite a large family, which ensured a strong line of heirs to continue the dynasty. So by this point, the Norman dynasty is strongly established. There's no question of their legitimacy, and there's no real rival claimant to the territory. So we have a much greater sense of stability and consolidation than in the time of their forebears. Gunnar also left her mark on Normandy through her patronage of the church. Like her husband, she supported the establishment of religious institutions, including monasteries and abbeys. Let me jump back. All right. Which became centers of learning and culture. All right. And turning to, as a brief to briefly detract from the main story, the main lineage, let's take a look at their daughter Emma of Normandy. So Emma was the daughter of Richard I and Gunnar. She married Ethelred II, King of England, in the year 1002. This was a strategic alliance aimed at solidifying ties between Normandy and England. However, Ethelred was not in a stable position at this time. Although coming from a long line of Wessex kings, he was under attack from other Vikings, particularly from the Danish king Sven Forkbeard. Emma and Ethelred had two sons, also a very interesting story, but not something we can really go into detail with today. Two sons, Edward and Alfred, who would later play key roles in the wars of succession for the English throne. King Ethelred died in 1016 at a very unstable period in England's history, and the kingdom fell into chaos. It became embroiled in civil war with various factions vying for control, and the Viking invasion remaining a dominant threat. The path of Canute, later known by the epithet the Great, the son of Sven Forkbeard, to the English throne, was solidified after his triumph over Edmund Ironside at the Battle of Assendun on the 18th of October 1016. This battle proved decisive, and the two leaders agreed to a division of the kingdom, a very short-lived division of the kingdom, in which Edmund would rule over Wessex, his ancestral homeland, while Canute took control of the rest of the country. As one might imagine, this did not last. Edmund's life was cut short when he died on 13 November 1016 in controversial circumstances, leaving Canute as the undisputed king of all England. Here we see a depiction of the Battle of Assendun on the 18th of October 1016 from a medieval manuscript. Emma's position shifted dramatically with her marriage to Canute in 1017, so second time she's married into the ruling English family. She became, once again, not only the Queen of England, but in fact Queen Consort of Denmark and Norway, really serving to entwine her legacy with the Scandinavian royal houses. The marriage between Emma and Canute would produce two children, a son, Harthacnut, who would later become King of England in Denmark, and a daughter, Gunilda, future wife to Henry III, Holy Roman Emperor. So I think it's really quite interesting to see that by this point, the Norman legacy has expanded out so vastly from its origins, right? So from simple Viking raiders, they've really expanded to be intrinsically embedded in the royal tapestry of Europe, right? Beyond the borders of France, into England, into the Holy Roman Empire, into Denmark and Norway. We see their influence has spread essentially everywhere by this point. Well, Richard II, the brother of Emma and eldest son of Richard I and Gunnar. Richard inherited the Duchy of Normandy in 996 following the death of his father. He was born around perhaps born around the 960s, although the year of his birth is disputed, and he ascended to power at a time when Normandy was reasonably stable. It gave him an opportunity to focus more on internal development and cultural flourishing. His reign lasted until 1026 and is often regarded as the Golden Age of Normandy, hence his epithet of the good. From the beginning, Richard II sought to strengthen the duchy's institutions and to reinforce its Christian identity. Like his mother and his father, he continued in his commitment to supporting the church, founding new monasteries, and expanding the existing religious institutions, with one notable example being the Abbey of Viking, which Richard developed into a major center of learning and spirituality, essentially an early university, and we see that pictured here on the manuscript. Politically, Richard II was a shrewd diplomat, much like his forebears, maintaining Normandy's independence and forging key alliances. He importantly strengthened ties with the French crown, allying himself with King Robert II, also known as Robert the Pious. And it's in a significant way, Richard's support of the church really helped in this alliance with the French crown as well, with Robert being a pious king. This alliance helped to protect Normandy from external threats, largely from the Holy Roman Empire and the rival Duchy of Brittany. As we see, Brittany is often the problem here. Brittany and Normandy having very tense relations for much of the history of Normandy. Richard's reign also saw efforts to curb internal dissent. He faced challenges from various rebellious vassals and neighboring lords, and through a combination of military strength and negotiation, he successfully suppressed revolts and reinforced the authority of the ducal court. One other significant aspect of Richard's rule was his management of the growing Norman economy. Under his rule, Normandy became a hub of trade and agriculture, with its ports facilitating commerce across the English Channel and throughout Europe. His policies encouraged the integration of Viking maritime expertise with Frankish economic systems and laid the groundwork for Normandy's wealth in the centuries to follow. Richard also continued the family tradition of strengthening the Norman lineage and legitimacy through marriage. His own union with Judith of Brittany in the year 1000 was a strategic alliance that bolstered Normandy's ties to the neighboring region. Judith was said to be a woman of exceptional intelligence and influence and became a key partner in his governance. Their marriage would produce several children who would carry the Norman legacy forward. We'll see more about her in a moment. Richard's reign ended with his death in 1026, but his legacy endured as he left behind a prosperous, stable, and culturally vibrant duchy. A little more about his wife, Judith of Brittany. She was married to she was married to Richard II in the Christian sense, in the legitimate sense, not the Mordanico custom. So as Duchess, she played a vital role in shaping Normandy. She was a critical figure in the forging of alliances. She was said to have been born in or around the year of 982 to Conan I, the Duke of Brittany. Again, as I mentioned, there's this ongoing rivalry with Brittany, so it's really a political match, right? And it's an attempt to calm things down, to come to an arrangement with their neighbors. And Judith's mother was Ermengarde of Anjou, so she is connected to two of the most influential regions in medieval France. As a carefully calculated union, this marriage brought a much needed alliance between the two often warring regions with their contentious border. She had a profound influence on Normandy, with her noble lineage giving her a claim to authority that complemented Richard's own. And her political insight helped to strengthen ties with her Breton homeland while advancing Normandy's position in the French kingdom. Both her intelligence and her piety are well documented. She took a very active role in both religious and cultural patronage, working alongside her husband to expand the Abbey of Fécamp that we mentioned earlier, as well as other religious and educational institutions. And she passed away in the year 1017 at the age of 35. Turning now to their son, Richard III, of Normandy. Well, Richard III was not a direct link in the ancestry of William the Conqueror, but he was the next heir or successor to the duchy. When Richard II passed away in 1026, he inherited the duchy at a young age, around the age of 9 or 10. His reign was marked by conflict and instability from the very start. We find his younger brother Robert growing restless and leading a rebellion. This rebellion would later culminate in a battle that ultimately ended without a clear victor, forcing them into an uneasy truce. Shortly after the truce, Richard's health mysteriously began to deteriorate, and he died suddenly in 1027 at the age of 21. While some historians argue that it was a natural illness, there were many rumors, and continue to be many rumors, that Robert may have been involved in his older brother's death. So, turning to his brother, known variously as Robert the Magnificent or Robert the Devil, I think it's safe to say he was a rather divisive figure. Robert became Duke of Normandy following the untimely death and suspicious death of his brother. The controversy surrounding his brother's death earned him the darker of his two epithets, Robert the Devil. Despite this inauspicious beginning, Robert quickly demonstrated his capabilities as a ruler. He continued the work of his predecessors in maintaining Norman independence and managing its complex relationship with the French crown. Robert's reign saw ongoing tensions with the French King Henry I, as well as these continuing tensions with neighboring lords. One of Robert's most significant military endeavors was his intervention in Flanders. In 1035, Robert supported Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, in his rebellion against his father, Baldwin IV. Although a very risky move, this did achieve the aim of strengthening the Norman-Flemish alliance, and this would secure a valuable ally for Normandy in future conflicts. Robert's commitment to Norman expansion and influence also extended to his involvement in southern Italy. Norman knights acting as mercenaries were already gaining a foothold in the region, and Robert is believed to have supported their efforts, indirectly contributing to the establishment of Norman rule in southern Italy, which is really a testament to the far-reaching ambitions of the Norman dukes. And while we don't have time to go into the Norman influence in Italy in today's lecture, it would definitely be an interesting topic for a future talk. Robert's personal life added another layer of intrigue to his story. He fathered an illegitimate child, William, as in our William the Conqueror, by a woman named Herleva. Her origins remain a matter of debate, as we mentioned at the beginning of today's talk. Despite his illegitimacy, Robert recognized him as his heir, setting the stage for William's eventual rise to one of history's most influential rulers. The most famous episode of Robert's life was most likely his pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1035. Some historians and commentators saw this as a desire to atone for his earlier sins, possibly the murder of his brother. Robert embarked on this arduous journey to the Holy Land. The pilgrimage was a monumental undertaking, showcasing both his deep religiosity and his adventurous spirit, though unfortunately, Robert fell ill on his return journey and died in Nicaea in modern-day Turkey, leaving Normandy in the hands of his young son, William, who was at that time 8 years old. This would begin a turbulent period in Normandy's history. With William's minority, the duchy was plunged into a power struggle among ambitious nobles. Robert's life was really a study in contrast, marked by both controversy and magnificence. Whether as Robert the Devil or as Robert the Magnificent, he undeniably left an indelible mark on Normandy's history, shaping its trajectory and ensuring its enduring influence on medieval Europe. Turning to perhaps the most fascinating woman of all we have looked at today, Herleva, also known as Arlot of Falaise. She's thought to have been born around the year 1003, although her exact date of birth is disputed. In Falaise, Falaise was a small but strategically significant town in Normandy at the time. Most accounts identify her father as a man by the name of Fulbert, thought to be a tanner, although some accounts give him as a chamberlain in Robert's court. Regardless, he's thought to have a very modest background, and this has fueled speculation and myth. Some chroniclers have the tendency of exaggerating his humble origins. Others suggest he might have been from more of a middling status, engaged in local administration as a chamberlain or otherwise. But regardless, Herleva would not have been considered a suitable match for the likes of Robert. As such, their relationship was certainly unconventional for its time. Two were never married, likely on account of Herleva's lower status, but their bond was strong enough that Robert would acknowledge their son William as his legitimate heir. This recognition was rather extraordinary in the broader context of society, but not too surprising in the sense of if we have a look back at some of Robert's ancestors where we've had similar situations with the children of consorts or wives in the more Danico or in the Danish custom being legitimized and then succeeding to the duchy. The fact that this illegitimate child would rise to become the King of England, however, is really quite extraordinary. There are various stories or anecdotes about how they met. One anecdote suggests that Robert first saw her lover as she danced in Falaise, with her beauty and vitality captivating the young Duke. Another version of the tale claims she was lowered into Robert's castle by rope to avoid the scrutiny of disapproving courtiers. While these stories are most likely romanticized, they underscore the enduring fascination with her lover's rise from relative obscurity to a position of historical significance. After William's birth in 1028, her lover continued to play a role in Norman politics. She married Herluin of Conteville, a Norman nobleman of respectable rank, and together they had two more sons, Odo and Robert, who would go on to be very significant people in William's life and in the history of Normandy. Odo would go on to become the powerful Bishop of Bayeux, very famous for the Bayeux Tapestry, and he would be a key supporter of his half-brother William during the conquest of England. Robert of Mortain became a major figure in William's campaigns as well. So despite her lover's modest beginnings, her legacy is really quite a profound one. She not only gave birth to William the Conqueror, but also influenced the careers of other children, ensuring their loyalty to William and their roles in his success. Well, that brings us full circle. As we draw this journey through history to a close, we reflect on the extraordinary tapestry woven by the ancestors of William I, William the Conqueror. From the daring exploits of the raider Rollo, the Viking who carved out a duchy on foreign soil, to the piety and diplomacy of Richard II, each generation of Norman leaders built upon the legacy of those who came before. The story of William's lineage is not merely one of conquest and power. It is a narrative of cultural and political adaptation and resilience, of individuals who embraced change and forged alliances across cultures and faiths. Through these generations and their fascinating stories and exploits, the Normans evolved from Norse raiders to a sophisticated ruling class, balancing the martial traditions of their Viking forebears with the Christian and Frankish ideals of their adopted homeland. This rich legacy culminated in William himself, a man born under uncertain circumstances, who defied the odds in uniting his duchy and claiming the English throne. Viewed in this broader context, the Norman conquest of 1066 was not an isolated event, but the apex of centuries of preparations, a moment when the ambitions and strategies of its ancestors bore their ultimate fruit. With that, I think it's a good note on which to bring the lecture to a conclusion. I have here listed a couple of the sources used in today's talk. Some of the sources are more general. Here we have the website of the Augustan Society. If you are interested in knowing more about the Society of Descendants of the Conquest in particular, you may find that through the Augustan Society website in the Lineage Groups tab. There is some general information here, some secondary sources at the Encyclopedia Britannica, some good books that provide a general overview of the Normans at this time and the ancestry of William the Conqueror. In terms of primary sources, I've here listed some of the key ones. There are more, of course, but these are some of the ones I specifically referred to in today's talk. Well, I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to attend today and to join us in exploring the fascinating subject of Normandy during the medieval period and the foundations of what would become William the Conqueror's England. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing everyone at the next lecture in future. Bye for now.